Ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome to you this morning. It is brilliant to have you with us for this speech. It's a great pleasure to welcome Iain Duncan Smith back to the Centre for Social Justice. It's excellent to be reunited, even if only for an hour or two. This morning, I'm Christian Guy, I'm the Director of the CSJ, and we're excited to have you with us. It was 10 years ago that the Centre was founded by Iain and Philippa and others. And in that decade, I think the CSJ has set out an interesting agenda for important social reform. Iain led a piece of work called Breakthrough Britain, and that publication set out almost 200 ideas for what we could do to turn lives around in the most difficult parts of the UK. The CSJ is working on a second Breakthrough Britain report, and it would be wrong of me not to mention that this morning. You'll be hearing from us again this year. We want to take the opportunity in the year before the next general election to revisit some of those important discussions, to bring new transformative ideas to the political community on all sides of the House of Commons and on the House of Lords, so that we can make the case for people who need that second chance society to be built further. But this morning we are here to listen to Iain talk about the principles behind welfare reform, the journey of welfare reform, and exactly why he is leading one of the most important programmes of reform under the coalition government. And when, of course, the coalition came into power, there was nothing more important socially that they needed to do than to fix a broken and damaging benefit system. So Iain, it is brilliant to have you with us this morning. Welcome back, and over to you.
Christian, thank you very much indeed. It is good to be back, although I have to say that since I left what's galling is you've gone from strength to strength, so I'm not sure what that tells you about me or about you, but anyway. And it's a pleasure really to come to the CSJ and be hosted here at the CSJ in your 10th year, setting out a vision for Britain's welfare state alongside the organisation where, in a sense, it kind of all started. And within the critique, the CSJ set out a plan, as you've just described, for reform for government. And today I think I want to have a look at that and how that works. But first, I just really need to remind all of us here of what we found when we came here in 2010. We inherited an economy which had entered the worst recession in living memory, with the deficit rising, costs spiralling, and GDP shrinking. People were losing their jobs, and many families feared for their futures. So it was vital that we immediately set out this long-term economic plan to put this right and secure Britain's future, at the heart of which was the need to cut the deficit. Now, the left would frame this as a rigid dichotomy. On one side, those opposing cuts, decrying all savings as an assault on the poor and the vulnerable, and on the other side, those arguing that the whip had to be cracked harder, clamping down on spending and making even deeper cuts. Yet the reality is rather more complex. After all, if we didn't reduce the deficit, I think and hope it would be obvious to all that the biggest losers in the end would be those who depend most on public services and the welfare safety net. So today I want to show that we would have wanted to reform the welfare state even if we had no deficit on arrival. As Conservatives, we should hate the idea of people with unfilled potential languishing on welfare. Welfare reform is fundamentally, and it must fundamentally be, about opportunity and life change, cutting the cost of social failure by transforming the life chances of those who are on benefits, restoring fiscal stability and restoring lives at the same time. 10 years ago at the CSJ, our aim was to gain a better understanding of why people found themselves trapped in disadvantage, and alongside that to develop solutions for helping them break free and secure their futures. In visit after visit to some of the most deprived areas in the country, I and others came to see how urgently that life change was needed. In neighbourhoods blighted by worklessness, where gangs were prevalent, debt and drugs the norm, families broken down, those living there had one thing it seemed in common. They were, for the most part, dependent on the state for their daily needs. With income inequality under Labour the worst for a generation, whilst the middle-class majority were aware of the problems in poor communities, they remained largely unaware of the true nature of life on some of our estates. For too long, we let these problems be ghettoised, out of sight, out of mind, as though they were in a different country. For too long, we existed in that semi-state. Even now, for the most part, they remain out of sight, meaning people are shocked when they are confronted with a TV programme such as Benefit Street. The reality is that our welfare system has become distorted, no longer the safety net I think it was once intended to be. Too often, it has become an entrapment, as it has been for 1 million people left on incapacity benefit for a decade or more the more than 4 million abandoned on out-of-work benefits even before the recession began. At its very worst, the present system makes criminals out of those trapped in its clutches. Faced with losing up to 94 pence in some cases of every pound that they earn because of how the benefits are withdrawn, too many of these people end up in the shadow economy or working cash in hand and not declaring it. Such behaviour, of course, can never be condoned, but it is a tragic state of affairs and a mark of how far the current system has failed that people should feel pushed into crime by having their aspirations to make a living penalised. Surely the system, logically, should deliver for people who want to work hard and play by the rules. Met with the problem of social breakdown, the left would have it that a sympathetic approach is to sustain these people on slightly better incomes. The accepted wisdom of the last government being that poverty is about money and more state money should solve it. As a result, the last government ratcheted up welfare bills by an enormous 60%. And rarely did they stop to ask, however, what that impact that money was actually having. No matter if it kept individuals from the labour market, if it labelled them incapable, if it placed them in housing that they could never have afforded if they took a job. Where for most people, their life's direction of travel is dictated by the informed decisions they make. Can they afford a larger family? Should they move in order to take up that better paid job? Can they risk the mortgage to get a bigger home? Yet too often, for those locked in the benefit system, that process of making responsible and positive choices has been skewed. Money paid to cut for them their choices, to pacify them regardless, with no incentive to aspire for a better life. And I've long believed that there is no kindness in a benefit system that traps people, leaving them in a twilight world where life is dependent on what is given to you rather than what you are able to create. Yet at the same time, caution, casual disapproval of those on benefits is also too easy. It does us as politicians well to remember that it was generations of us as politicians that created this welfare system that now traps them. Our single-minded aim has been, and must continue to be, to change a system that has left too many only with short-term, narrow options within parameters set by the state. Of course, in the most severe cases of sickness and disability, it is absolutely right that welfare should support individuals and help them throughout their lives. But even then, it must be more than just sustainment alone. It should be about helping people to make greater control over their lives. For all those who are able to work, work should be seen as the route to doing so. For work is about more than just money. It is about what shapes us, lifts our families, delivers security, and helps rebuild our communities. Work has to be at the heart of our welfare reform plan, or all we will do is increase dependency not lessen it. Reform, often I think overused, is in reality about transformation. Transformation and life change. Improving people's lives through the choices that they make. A journey from dependence to independence. As Conservatives, for me, that part of our party's historic mission is exactly this. Just look at Wilberforce and Shaftesbury, putting back hope where it had gone, to give people from chaotic lives security through hard work, helping families to improve the quality of their own lives. In government, the challenge has to be to act on that ambition and make changes to restore a creaking and chaotic welfare system into one which delivers on that vision for life change. Welfare as a journey that people are on rather than a destination where they stay. So let me just explain this and illustrate it. The guiding principle underpins the welfare reforms we are driving through now. Families should face similar choices regardless of whether they are on benefits or in work. And the welfare system should both reward the right choices and remove the stumbling blocks in people's way. I'm not going to list all the policies, but I want to illustrate what I mean by way of some examples. First and foremost, in achieving change is universal credit, simplifying a mess of benefits and tax credits. But what's more, and this is really important, resetting it so that the time on benefit resembles time in work. Take the fact that today, over 3/4 of the people in work are paid monthly. A simple point, but a big change from 20 years ago. Yet the benefit system remains unchanged. An archaic arrangement of fortnightly payments reflects a work environment very different to the experience of most who are in the work area. A big upheaval, therefore, for those who are used to being in a job and have fallen unemployed. With the majority of those who fall unemployed back in work in months, why make life so difficult for them as they crash out of work? Surely the journey between benefit and work should be simple. That is why universal credit is and will be paid monthly. It comes as no surprise that in the Pathfinder areas where we've been rolling it out, over 3/4 of those involved in it are now confident about managing their money each month. In turn, this then frees up our resource to target help at the most vulnerable people who actually then need supporting through these choices. For those out of work for longer, imagine how hard it is to move into employment and budget monthly when all you have known is fortnightly money. Surely we should help this minority to develop their budgeting skills, easing that transition into work, instead of simply waiting for them to crash out of a job because they simply couldn't cope managing their money over that longer period, which happens too often. It is the same with getting people online through this process of universal credit and paying their own rent. With 92% of jobs in the UK now requiring some kind of basic IT skill, there is a real opportunity through a system change to prepare people at last for a world of work and the choices to go back to work. And most of all, we achieve that by making work pay, allowing the person who has never had a job at that moment of incredible realization, this realization that this is now their first step into work, and it is the first step for the rest of their lives. This then is the fundamental cultural change that universal credit delivers. Welfare should be seen as no different from work itself. For those who are not employed but capable of doing so, whilst you may not have a job and the state supports you, you are in work to find work. Through the claimant commitment, which is being rolled out all over the country, which deliberately mirrors a contract of employment, we are making this deal unequivocal. Those in work have obligations to their employer. So too claimants a responsibility to the taxpayer. In return for support, and where they are able, they must do their bit, therefore, to find work. And as we roll out universal credit, the behavioural effect we are seeing has been remarkable. Those on universal credit, those claimants, are now spending twice as long looking for work than their counterparts elsewhere. And they understand their requirements better through this contractual process and are more assiduous in meeting those requirements. So this, I believe, is welfare reform in action, changing the dynamics of the system, making things simpler, preparing people for work, and ensuring that work always pays, and rewarding positive behaviour. Ensuring security, therefore, through work, just as our pensions reforms, at the same time, are helping ensure security in retirement. Changing a culture and changing lives. But as well as smoothing people's journey into work, it is vital that we also remove those obstacles blocking their path to make those positive choices. That is where the benefit cap is all about. Another example of striking cultural change, ending the something for nothing entitlement and returning fairness to a system that seemed to have been skewed into an unfair state. Before we implemented the cap, it was possible for someone to receive, in some cases, almost twice as much in benefits as the average weekly wage. This system wasn't fair on hard-working taxpayers, paying out ever-increasing amounts to sustain others in lifestyles that they could barely dream of affording themselves. But importantly, it has not been fair on benefit recipients themselves. It cuts two ways. How many of us here would want to live trapped in a system where it was more worthwhile sitting on benefits than taking that big decision to enter the world of work? Now, having capped the amount paid to some 30,000 households so far, these families face the same choices about where they live and what they can afford as everybody else. What's more, by exempting those on tax credits, i.e. those taking a job, we have ended the perverse incentive to remain on welfare as a way of life and left the door open to the positive behaviour of returning to work. Since being notified that they were potentially to be capped, more than 19,000 people have since made that positive step back into work. And third, so it is with the removal of the spare room subsidy. For too long, we have been content to subsidise people on housing benefit living in homes in the UK which had 1 million spare bedrooms, taking money from taxpayers, many themselves making difficult decisions about where they can afford to live. We became accustomed to paying out for this, even when, at the same time, some 2 million families were being squeezed into miserably overcrowded accommodation, and others having to sit on housing waiting lists in the hope of one day obtaining a home. Too many lives left unnecessarily blighted and insecure because we wouldn't make the change. And whilst we always knew that it would be difficult, none of this is easy, we simply could not let the system go on like that. Interestingly, in general, Labour's position in opposition to all of our reforms has been incredibly short-sighted, in my opinion, and opportunistic. Not only have they opposed the vast majority of our changes, but they, I believe, have pandered to their worst instincts through campaigns set to whip up unnecessary fear. And nothing, I think, illustrates it more than on this particular issue. I was looking back and I discovered that when they were actually in government, one of their most respected Works and Pensions Minister, a man I admired enormously, Malcolm Wicks, who sadly has died, expressed their position at that time, and I want to quote this. And he said that they hope to implement a flat-rate housing benefit system in the social sector similar to that anticipated in the private rented sector. So ending the subsidy has meant that in essence everyone, be they in social or the private rented sector, faces choices about that they can afford, and others in overcrowded homes can be helped to live in accommodation that can fit their family. And what's more, it is also, I believe, and will do, prompt councils and housing associations to understand their tenants' needs and make better decisions about managing their resources instead of building the wrong houses to meet demand, a situation which did too little to help those in need. But it's not enough to manage the symptoms of disadvantage. To make a meaningful and lasting difference requires that we treat the cause of the problem, whether it be worklessness and welfare dependency, family breakdown, educational failure, debt or addiction. These are the multiple and overlapping problems that cause people to find themselves in difficulty in the first place. As we defined it at the CSJ those years ago, the 5 pathways that lead people into poverty. In office, I believe we have made real inroads into addressing these pathways, always with the aim of life change, establishing social justice as a priority for government and paving the way to go even further in the future. We've put families first, looking at the family as a whole and addressing their problems, I believe, in the round. And now as we look to extend the Troubled Families programme from 120,000 to another 400,000 families, those once in the hands of piecemeal and inefficient social services will receive the intensive tailored support that can bring lasting change. After the family, next comes children's education, and here, where previously those from poorer backgrounds were allowed to trail behind their peers, now my colleague Michael Gove is ensuring that once again education is seen by struggling families as the route to a better life for their children. A good education policy is one that leaves no child left behind, and that, I believe, is Michael's. And throughout our welfare reforms, as I've explained, we are getting people into employment, and we fought so hard for investment in childcare in order that work pays when they get into employment. Through ongoing investment in credit unions, and finally clamping down on the predatory practices of payday lenders, we're helping individuals escape the spiral of problem debt. And through pioneering new approaches across the prison, employment and rehabilitation services, we're pushing ahead with an approach to tackling addiction that delivers lasting life change, not parking people in a state that simply means they may not commit crime, but lasting life change, meaning individuals getting clean and back on track, free from the scourge of their addiction to drugs or alcohol. It is interventions such as this and many more that I believe will make a big difference as they collect together, helping people who might once have been left on the sidelines to turn their own lives around. The importance of this historic break from the old ways of approaching social problems cannot be underestimated. We must learn the lessons of the previous decade, where despite Labour's best intentions, and I believe they were, and despite an unprecedented level of spending, the government failed to meet the poverty target they had set for themselves. Now, I've long maintained that the first problem was the target itself, a fixation on relative income and a moving poverty line that became ever harder to reach. But equally problematic was the mechanistic approach, as the government chased that target by hiking income transfers to families and children, spending more on benefits overall, and creating a whole new system of credits which cost 4.5 times more than the ones that they replaced. Between 2003 and 2010, the last government spent over 170 billion on tax credits alone, and 70% of that spending, some 120 billion, was paid in child tax credits. Yet I believe that that spending failed to meet its objectives because it put a process ahead of people, failing to ask what impact it was having on changing lives. To put it another way, what more could have been achieved had that money been invested in a much more focused way to create lasting improvements to people's life chances, be it a higher attainment in schools, better budgeting skills, recovery from addiction, and so on. That is why the government's child poverty strategy recognises that money matters, but also that other factors are fundamental to children's current well-being and their future life chances. In the past, while some families may have moved over an arbitrary poverty line as a result of more welfare spending, sadly, too often, their lives remained unproductive and insecure. And quite often, if you take a family that would have been on drugs or abusing alcohol, much of that money may have been spent in the wrong place, and their own families would have remained officially over the poverty line, but unofficially rooted in poor lives. This terrible waste of human potential showed itself not only in the child poverty figures, but also in the labour market. Common sense should tell us that Britain simply cannot run a modern flexible economy if at the same time so many of the people who service that economy are trapped in dependency on the state, unwilling or unable to play a productive part in the well-being of our country. And under Labour, millions were left out on benefits with no access to work. This in turn helped to create a demand for foreign workers as businesses looked to fill those jobs that British people didn't want or couldn't get. In just 5 years between 2005 and 2010, and I think this is quite a staggering set of figures, in 5 years between 2005 and 2010, the number of British people in jobs in this country fell by some 400,000, while the number of foreigners coming in doing British jobs soared by over 700,000. In other words, for every British person who fell out of work, almost 2 foreign nationals gained employment. Short-term policy making created damaging long-term consequences, destroying the ethos of a whole section of our society left behind in workless households and those deprived estates that I described at the start of the speech. The simple truth is that we should never have been prepared to see a growing number of our fellow citizens fall into dependency, hopelessness, and despair. For without their active contribution, we will be unable to create that modern economy that we so wish for. And it's not only migration that rises as a result. Crime and health costs rise as well. They are high in such difficult community. The last government economic policy seemed to be founded on bringing in cheap labour from abroad, whilst British families sat on the sidelines. Apart from the bad economics, I believe it was also incredibly damaging to people's lives. Just imagine the damage done to some 2 million children living in households where no one worked. No. Leaving people behind is not a long-term economic model. Instead, we have stuck to our economic plan, and now the economy is growing. This growth has produced a rise of more than 1.5 million people in private sector jobs, and this quarter, the largest increase in employment for some 40 years. Importantly, we're also seeing promising signs that the trend of bringing in migrant workers at the expense of British workers is now being reversed. As we reach record levels of people going back into work, as the figures showed us, the latest data that shows that the rise in employment over the past year, over 90% of those jobs went to UK nationals. What's more, the number of people available and unavailable for work, that relationship has shifted. So the number of people unavailable for work, having dropped out of the labour market altogether, is at its lowest now for 2 decades, driven by falling numbers claiming the main out-of-work benefits, down by over 500,000 since 2010. Britain now has a lower proportion of workless households than at any time under the last government. And 274,000 fewer children are living in workless households, meaning children who now have a role model to look up to, offering hope and self-worth, with aspiration for their own futures transformed. As the economy recovers, this is where the real effect of our reforms is felt. British people having a fair chance to access the jobs that are being created, taking up work that pays, ensuring that everyone begins to see the benefits of Britain's growth. This is not just about those who are on welfare, and I stress this speech is not just about them. It is also about vital reform for those who are not. For they will benefit not just from reduced costs, but perhaps, I believe, more importantly, from a long-term social settlement, which in turn will lead to a settled society in which all are acknowledged to play a full part. Nothing illustrates the government's commitment to the process of life change more than the Chancellor's confidence that because our economic plan, he believes, is working, Britain can afford to raise the national minimum wage. I think he's absolutely right. For restoring the value of the minimum wage would send a powerful, positive message. His recommendation shows that we can and do care that people on low incomes should see a better level of pay to give them that greater security. A stable economic settlement requires a strong social settlement. You cannot reform one without the other, and thus welfare reform is one very important part of a larger long-term economic plan. With the public finances left in tatters by the last government and our rapidly growing benefits bill a significant reason why the deficit was so high, curbing welfare spending has of course been crucial. Working closely with the Chancellor as part of cutting the deficit by a third already, by half next year, we've seen that welfare state on a sustainable footing for the future. And that is achieved by helping people move towards self-sufficiency in order that the demand on welfare itself lessens. As a result, welfare spending is now falling as a percentage of GDP, and our reforms are forecast to save a total of around 50 billion by the end of this Parliament. Yet our real success, I believe, has been to reframe the argument, challenging a narrative beloved of the left, which focuses so exclusively on how much is being spent on welfare that it actually risks overlooking the real question. That is not about how much goes into the benefit system, but what difference it makes to people at the other end. We all accept the need to continue that process of welfare reform, and the next government will have to make further changes. But more than that, we are committed to making a lasting difference, preventing spending from simply popping back up further down the line, which is why we will remain focused on life change. A reformed welfare system that will catch you when you fall, but lift you when you can rise. Our vital reforms are a major undertaking that reaches beyond this Parliament. Thus, as we look towards establishing a manifesto for the next election, it is a case of looking at which parts of the system promote productive choices and which are limiting people's horizons. Asking how best we can lift people up, urging them forwards on the journey to independence and to security. Britain will only be great again if all in our society are part of that economic recovery and growth. Conservative philosophy for me has always been about people's lives, about families, about Bert's little platoons that make up the communities we so admire and cherish. So as we modernise our work practices and create a more flexible and responsible economy, it is important that this is underpinned by social change. Everyone who can play is playing a productive role. Individuals in control of their own lives, and the next generation of children aspiring even more. In other words, reform that is not just about state institutions, but about social renewal. Part of a conservative vision of strong families with hope for their children's future, but who also care about their communities. The task that we have set out to achieve is hardly a small undertaking. And it is not easy, as those arrayed against us do all they can to misrepresent what we are trying to do, angling for a return to what I believe to be the failed and expensive policies of the past, when success was measured by the amount of money you spent, not the lives that you actually improved. So I believe, very simply, that the purpose of this government is not radical, but balanced, not grand, but simple. It is that through our economic and welfare changes, we will have helped people feel that bit more secure about their lives and their grandparents' lives as well. Feel more hopeful about their children's futures and rekindle their pride in their communities as their neighbours also begin to thrive. That, for me, and it should be for all of us, is the human dimension to all that we do. Thank you.